Last Wednesday, Democratic Governor Tony Evers signed his first budget. It spent $81.7 billion with a B according to the Legislative Fiscal Bureau. That's a 5.6% increase over the current budget. And it was passed by Republican legislators, the Democratic governor interacting with Republican legislators. It was a fascinating process. We're all happy that it was signed on July 3rd. So it's time for a Capitol Roundtable with three of my fellow Capitol reporters. Riley Vetterkind is a Capitol reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal. Molly Beck, Capitol reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Bob Hague is news director for the Wisconsin Radio Network. We're all glad that it was signed on July 3 and didn't ruin our summers, aren't we? Yes, we are. We are. Bob, I want to start with you. The governor took office early in January. 6 months later, what do we now know about Governor Tony Evers' governing style that we didn't perhaps know in January, and just vis-a-vis the budget?
Sure. First of all, it's hard to believe that it was only last Wednesday that the budget got signed, right? The news cycle being what it is these days, it seems like a month ago already, but so the process that the governor and Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, because they very definitely did this as a team, that they used to put together a budget was that they went around the state and they held public listening sessions to put together what they called the shades of Howard Zinn here, the people's budget. And in that, the governor laid out a frankly very progressive agenda for what he wanted to do with the budget and what he wanted to do for the people of Wisconsin. And the cornerstone of that was accepting the Medicaid expansion money, which we heard almost immediately from leadership in the legislature was a non-starter. So the governing style of the governor, I mean, he definitely placed a marker down with that budget. And I guess sort of laid a challenge out for the Republicans to do what they would with that, and they did. The legislature's Joint Finance Committee then held their own hearings and solicited public comment on what people wanted in a budget and put together the package that then the governor moved on to use his partial veto on last week.
Much different style, though, with Governor Evers than Governor Walker. Is he still Tony Too Nice at the end of 6 months into his term?
I detected there was a little, when the governor said last Wednesday that to veto the entire budget would have been, can you help me out with the exact phrasing? I don't know if he said,
it would have been politics as usual, or it would have been Washingtonian
right,
in a way, I think he was saying. Yeah.
I mean, there was a little snark there, because the implication was, I'm not going to do what they do, right, by vetoing the entire package. And sure, there's the nice Governor Evers, but there's always a little edge there, I think. And I think we saw that in Milwaukee yesterday, maybe unintentionally, when he was asked about the Tesla provision veto, which he said was a payoff. Now that's kind of a hot button term to use, but and again, it may have been unintentional. But the governor can have a little edge to go along with the niceness.
Before we talk about whether he seriously considered vetoing the entire GOP budget, I want to give Riley and Molly a chance to talk about their impressions of Governor Tony Evers in January, Governor Tony Evers in July. So please.
Yeah, I covered education before I covered the Capitol, and so I've been covering Tony Evers for a few years now, and he still seems like the same guy, but I have noticed that since becoming governor, he's been put in positions that he was not in as state superintendent, even though the Republican legislature and Republican Governor Scott Walker and him as state superintendent didn't agree on much. But when the fighting started between the legislature and the governor, I mean, that's something that was a new element, I think, for him, maybe to his personality too. I don't think you would have expected that before, where there just wasn't a lot of talking going on, and it was kind of hard to figure out who was to blame there. But it certainly, you could tell he talked about wanting to compromise, and it just was difficult with the circumstances.
Riley, do you think there was ever a one-on-one negotiating session the governor with the Vosses and with the Fitzgerald? Did he ever sit across the table and say, how about this, will you accept this? Or did that never happen?
I mean, my guess would be that I mean, I know that they've had brief conversations, but I've been chatting with a few people, and a lot of people seem to be of the understanding that they really did just do this negotiating largely through the public and through the whole process by presenting a plan. The other side presented a plan, and then we saw that the governor eventually did go along with it for the most part. But was there any good faith negotiating?
Horse trading is a term that we often
Horse trading, yeah. I doubt it this time around.
Okay. Yeah. And anything you noticed in Governor Tony Evers in January vis-a-vis July, Riley?
Yeah, I think as Bob was saying and as Molly was saying, I think we've seen kind of an edgier style as the governor's kind of been getting a little bit more used to his role. I think one of the earliest indications that he really was willing to play hardball in certain situations was during the whole lame duck battle when he withdrew, I think it was 15 Walker appointees, and was willing to wage that legal battle. He eventually, as we know, lost it, but I think that shows that he's getting a little bit more comfortable in this role. But at the same time, when Robin Vos and Scott Fitzgerald are very willing to play that political game, he does still seem hesitant to engage with it. He calls it huffing and puffing. So he's kind of reluctantly going along with it. Right. It seems to me.
Yeah, the narratives on the face-to-face. We heard from Speaker Vos and Majority Leader Fitzgerald that they hadn't had that sit-down face-to-face meeting, and then we would hear from the governor, well, I'm available, but there just never seemed to be that.
But at the end of his budget signing, he said, I've talked to 130 of the 132 legislators. What did he say? I'm not a hermit or something?
No, the Hermit King, I think. Yes,
that's right, thank you. Molly, did he ever really consider vetoing the entire Republican budget, do you think?
I mean, that was a question that I think reporters started asking a lot because they had made such a big deal about the Medicaid expansion, and he said things like he would fight like hell to preserve that, even though, I mean, Republican lawmakers have opposed that for years, and as soon as that was proposed, they said that's not going to happen. So I think that's what raised the question. It was so important to him and his administration that's why we started asking the question. And then when you saw the budget passed out of the legislature, you saw Republican lawmakers saying, "Please don't veto the whole budget," But I
said, "Worst thing in the world if you vetoed the budget." Excuse me, Molly. Go ahead.
Right, but I don't know that it didn't seem to me that was ever really a threat, because even during all of the talk among the Republican lawmakers about urging the governor not to veto the budget, you didn't really hear that from Democrats urging him to veto the budget. And you didn't really hear that from him. He said, he would always say everything's on the table, which is, part of his style. He says that a lot about things. But I just didn't get the sense that was really ever going to happen.
And I felt that there were no calls after the budget was passed by the GOP ledge. Democratic Senator Schilling and Democratic leader Hintz never called for him to veto the whole thing.
Right.
Nobody did.
No. Right.
So
there was a couple people, but it wasn't nobody in leadership.
I think one member, one Democrat on finance made some reference to it, but nobody in leadership.
Right.
So he couldn't hold that out as, well, I was asked to by my elected representative.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I hadn't really thought about that, because throughout the entire JFC process, the Democratic members were criticizing the package that was being put together, but yet they stepped back from the brink, I guess, at the end, because, as you said, there were no calls by leadership to veto it.
And I think there's a political calculation there too. I mean, to veto the whole budget.
Wow.
The Assembly Speaker had said if that happens, they weren't going to come back till October. School districts start getting really anxious if they don't know what funding they're going to get by September, and funding for nursing homes and things like that. I mean, I think that might have blown up in
space. Once they met his additional number on transportation funding, and once they funded some critical healthcare programs, the aides or the personal care workers and others, they came pretty close. In fact, on some of those personal care workers and maybe on nursing homes, they exceeded what he recommended. So you agree, Riley, he never really seriously considered this was huffing and puffing?
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with everything that Molly said. I think the political risks were just far too great, and I mean, in an era of increasing partisanship, when you have to ask yourself, well, what does each side have to lose? Elections aren't until 2020, and voters may not be paying attention to the budget debate. They might be paying attention to national politics. Robin Vos was very clear that funding would potentially even go down, if not just being withheld until October. And with school districts complaining, I think the governor made the calculation, at least, that vetoing the entire document would have been way too politically risky. And as he noted in his speech when he signed the budget, it just really wasn't worth that political risk for what would be gained.
And Riley, there was a new interactive style on the part of GOP leadership. For the first time, Governor Scott Walker wasn't over their shoulder saying, I'm not going to accept any increase in taxes and fees for transportation. So how do you assess the new interaction or the new leadership style of Speaker Vos and Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald without a GOP governor?
I think I haven't covered the two leaders under Governor Walker as much, but from what I've seen so far, it seems like they really are working a lot more in tandem than my understanding was under Governor Walker. I think in this budget cycle, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it often seemed like Speaker Vos would kind of lead the charge, and then Republican senators, Senator Fitzgerald had to see whether he got the support. He allowed the fiscal conservatives in that caucus to kind of express their concerns. There was a little shakiness toward the end on whether or not Chris Kappinga would go along with the budget, but I think it was a pretty in tandem approach that we saw between leadership.
At some point, Senator Fitzgerald said, this is an example of getting a budget done on time of when myself and Assembly Speaker Vos agree. And the backdrop, as you alluded to, was 2 years ago. They were fighting over transportation funding.
Oh, yeah.
And so a new chemistry between Vos and Fitzgerald?
I mean, it's very different from the last budget cycle. I mean, we spent most of the last budget cycle sitting outside of their caucus, closed caucus doors, like wanting to see like if they had come to an agreement on transportation funding. And there was just a lot of disconnect on a lot of issues that cycle, and but this time, like Riley said, I mean, it seemed like Speaker Vos set the tone, and they just were together on almost everything. I can't think of a time when they weren't this time. So.
Well, at least when they disagreed, it didn't come out. There was no public.
It wasn't public like it was before,
like
right?
it was last time.
Yeah,
that's the best thing.
Right.
Biggest winners in the budget?
Well, it was kind of a win-win, wasn't it? I mean, really.
You had enough money, so
Yeah.
there were a lot of winners.
Yeah, and in addition to, as Riley mentioned, just the political repercussions that would have resulted if he had vetoed the entire package, by not doing that, he looked statesmanlike, if I can, and the legislature came out looking good as well. So, I mean, it was a win-win. I think, Senator Fitzgerald said this is a great budget. So
They all said that.
They all said that, right?
The governor said it's a down payment.
Yeah.
It's a down payment that moved the needle. Excuse
So
me.
I'm going to just say this is a situation where the governor and legislative leadership both win. Yeah.
I think schools won too. I think with the governor's vetoes, where he added, what was it, 65 or 87 million more in funding through his vetoes for schools, and along with the 500 million increase that the Republican lawmakers passed. I mean, that's a big increase for a Republican controlled legislature. So
I also think potentially Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce is a big winner. Under a Democratic governor, the manufacturers tax credit remains intact. So that's something we could look to. So I think some of the losers in this battle, if there are any, obviously Tesla didn't get to sell directly to consumers in the state, so we can look there as well.
So, any other losers come to mind? There's a certain bridge in Kaukauna that was delisted, things like that. The governor talks about earmarking, excuse me. Any other losers? Certainly those who want to believe we should have 1, medical marijuana, and 2,
Right,
decriminalize.
right, that's right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
So interesting. Last week, Friday, I believe, Speaker Voss had kind of a post-mortem with us on the budget and was asked about marijuana. Now, they may agree on transportation, but the Speaker and the Majority Leader are miles apart on the subject of marijuana. But the Speaker wants to look at it this fall and said that he was hoping that it could be done in a way that would be suitable for Wisconsin as opposed to Michigan and now Illinois, and I guess Minnesota also allows medical marijuana. So an interesting discussion, but I thought back, the Speaker is opposed to recreational use. And
Well, the governor on February 28th recommended decriminalizing up to 25 grams. Do I have that right?
Right.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Sure, and somebody crunched the numbers as to how many joints that would be, and I guess not an insignificant amount. But last session, Senator Risser, and I wish I had asked Speaker Voss about this, Senator Risser and Representative Adam Jarkow, who's no longer in the legislature, actually floated a bill to decriminalize smaller amounts than was what the governor was talking about. So, that might be a discussion that can come up this fall too. All right, well, if you don't want to decriminalize the amount the governor wanted to decriminalize, how about some smaller amounts?
What about the idea, I'm going to ask you about this. A general loser was criminal justice reform, because remember the legislature put $5 million in to begin buying to begin the process of locating a new maximum security prison in Green Bay. The Green Bay and Pond prisons were built in the 19th centuries. So criminal justice reform, the governor would like to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana. He wants the overall subject of reform. This travels separately from the juvenile prisons issue. So do you think a potential loser here is the overall issue of adult criminal justice reform? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think just movement in that area in general didn't happen in this budget, even with the amount of funding that the governor was putting in there for to get this overhaul of the juvenile justice system going. I mean, that was taken out. So, I mean, a big question is when is that going to actually happen? There's a lot of concerns about where those new facilities are going to be, and there's support among legislative leadership to change the plan. So, and also the prison in Green Bay, there's no money. There was money proposed, and there's no money now, to do that. So. Yeah, I think there just wasn't any movement in
I want to ask
that
about
area.
one other topic. The governor says it's the year of clean water. His veto message said the legislature ponied up $32 million more for research and clean water funding. But he said that didn't go nearly enough. Clean water, a potential loser in this? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the challenges on that front are certainly varied.
With southwest Wisconsin and Kewaunee County, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, we've got PFAS identified in northeastern Wisconsin, where there is also the issue having to do with concentrated animal feeding operations and the impact on groundwater supplies there. And then there's lead pipes. I mean, there's so many fronts to the battle to assure clean water, if you will, that it's difficult to see how a comprehensive approach can really get through the process.
Speaker Voss has a task force on water quality,
Yes.
and it's possible that some legislation will come out of that, and that might be one of those things where, we've seen this tug of war over who gets the recognition for what, between the Democratic governor and the Republican legislature, and maybe that's one of those issues.
Well, I was struck. Governor Evers recommended $40 million to rebuild laterals from the muni water systems into homes. And Republican Representative Stephan stood up and said, we did this in Green Bay without state aid. Maybe Milwaukee, our largest city, should consider that. Boy, there was a little bit of an anti-Milwaukee sentiment there.
Well, Speaker Voss even trotted out the example of Madison doing
Right,
it without
right.
state aid and
Right.
said, well, if Madison can,
Right.
you know.
Right.
Let's dive into the issue of medical expansion. The governor repeatedly said MA expansion. The Marquette poll, 74% support. He said before the budget, I'm going to go around and build state support for it, public support for it, so I think I can get it across the finish line. He never did. It was one of the first things killed by joint finance. If there's such public support for it, why can't why can't it get a little bit further?
It's a fascinating tug of war between the two sides there. I mean, especially since the governor has tried to roll out this fiscal argument for why wouldn't you want to take this extra
Federal
money?
money's going
It's
to
your money.
Indiana
We should use it.
Illinois.
Senator Fitzgerald on the floor on the day that the budget passed out of the Senate gave a bunch of reasons why Republicans are really skittish about taking that federal money. They view upping the eligibility to 130%, 138% of the poverty level as basically increasing the poverty level. It's disingenuous in that sense. It's relying on federal funding when we don't know if that funding is going to materialize later.
They use a W word, welfare,
Yes.
expansion of welfare.
Which is-
Speaker Voss
that-
used that
Yeah.
word.
Continually. Is that a pretty effective PR argument to say expand welfare?
For their political argument, when we're operating in an economy that many would argue is the best in decades, and I think people when they hear the word welfare are if you polled them, they probably wouldn't support it too much. So I think politically, it's probably a smart move. Democrats, of course, would argue it's the farthest thing from welfare, and either way, they're still using this argument to turn down a ton of money, and it makes no fiscal sense. So.
And I think Democrats see a political opportunity with that issue too, even though they knew, there were no signs that was ever going to be successful from the Republican side. But I think they see that healthcare issue was good for them in the 2018 race. I think they see that as a good issue for them in 2020. So they're keeping it alive and probably kept, we're really hammering it during the budget cycle probably for that reason too.
While we're on the welfare debate, the Republicans use the same the same welfare issue when the governor vetoed drug testing and job training or on the job for food share recipients. And the governor said in his veto message, this is too tough on our low-income Wisconsin residents. Now, my question is, do you expect, Voss has alluded to potential veto overrides, which will not pass, obviously, but do you expect him to at some point try to override those two provisions, job training and drug testing for food share? Or is this just another...
if they do that, I think that would be one that they would, because I think that issue is always good for them. I think that polls well among Republican supporters always. So I think.
Would this just be an attempt to put some Democrats who are in close races potentially in November of 2020 on record, Molly?
That could be, yeah.
Yeah. I know Representative Nygren is not happy with that veto. He was on our affiliate in Green Bay yesterday and questioning why you would, as he put it, make it more difficult for people to become productive taxpayers by getting the drug treatment and job training.
It was interesting. The governor in his veto speech said, on Medicaid expansions, we're either going to elect legislators who will support it, or we're going to convert legislators who will be elected in November 2020. He's obviously drawing on the 74%. I just thought that was a very interesting threat for him to make as a first-term governor. Very interesting. Okay, new topic. Biggest question you have about the state budget. I'll go first. I really wonder why Republicans didn't go along with a small gas tax increase. It's 30.9%, not including the PECFA money. Hasn't been increased since 2006. And the governor gave him cover on February 28th when he said, let's come in with an 8-cent bump plus index, which would have taken it over a 2-year period to a 9.6-cent increase per gallon. So that's my nominee. Biggest question biggest surprise. I was surprised that the Republican senators didn't go with a 2 or 3 cent increase in the gas tax. Biggest surprise, Bob?
I'm going to have to agree with you there, Steve. I mean, really, and just in terms, this is a topic that's, just fascinated me, and I think anybody who spends any time driving around the state will understand why it's so interesting. When one sees the condition of, obviously not every road, but a lot of the roads. So yeah, you said they gave him cover. Why? Or he gave them cover. Why not? Because the long-term sustainability of the transportation fund is still, not great. Secretary Designee Thompson has been making that pitch that we need a stable funding source. Now, we can argue whether or not with more and more Teslas on the road, regardless of whether they were bought here or not, that a gas tax increase is a long-term sustainable solution. But I agree with you. That was the biggest surprise.
Biggest surprise, Molly?
Yeah, that was one. But I also was surprised that there wasn't any discussion about Medicaid expansion, given how hard the healthcare issue was for Republicans in 2018. You just saw the argument being twisted in knots with Republicans about the pre-existing conditions issue, and I guess I that was a surprise to me that wasn't at least discussed a little bit more. So.
And Riley?
I'd agree with Molly. I've been constantly scratching my head over where each side is on this Medicaid expansion issue. We saw basically, as Molly said, no movement whatsoever, despite this being beaten over Republicans' heads over and over and over again. I'm also very curious as to what happens, to what extent this does become an issue during the presidential race. I mean, these issues often get overshadowed by national issues, so it'll be interesting to see where this debate heads.
Especially if the Supreme Court takes jurisdiction in the challenge to Obamacare, because the argument now is once you strip out the tax, that the tax was a reason that Chief Justice John Roberts upheld it. So if the Supreme Court takes it and throws out Obamacare, then it's right in the middle of the next, obviously, presidential election and the next election. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Issues that are still out there and could potentially surface in the fall. Riley, you want to go first?
I think obviously marijuana is the big question. I think
you're casting it narrowly. Medical marijuana.
Medical marijuana, yes.
Okay.
Sorry. Medical marijuana is the big question. And I think what's really interesting about this issue is, we talk about Medicaid, where public polling shows people support it. Republicans have been very staunchly opposed to it. But on marijuana, we see this opening here where public support is high, maybe not even as high as what it was in that poll.
In Charles Franklin poll in April, 83% support medical marijuana with a doctor's prescription. Excuse me, go ahead.
Okay. No, I think, so clearly some Republicans are willing to move forward on this issue. I think my guess is that it makes a lot of political sense for Republicans to show voters that they'll move somewhat and they'll listen somewhat to public opinion on this issue as we move into 2020. Since as a lot of reporters have noted, we're kind of surrounded now by states that have legalized the recreational or medical marijuana.
Okay, got a few seconds left. Issues unresolved, Molly?
Yeah, medical marijuana for sure. After Speaker Voss mentioned that was a signal to me that that's going to come up again. But I think nonpartisan redistricting might come up in some way. I don't know how, but with 2020 coming and the support for that and that being stripped out of the budget, I think that might come up again.
Well, apparently there's a bill that would address that. So it would be interesting to see what sort of support that gets, what sort of necessary majority party support that gets. I'm guessing that it's not going to be sufficient to move it forward.
Senate Majority Leader Fitzgerald said that's not going to be an issue, not going to happen. My nominee is this clean water issue. I think we're going to wait for the recommendations of the Assembly Task Force because I think clean water comes back in a lot of different ways, still unresolved. Okay. Capitol Roundtable, I want to thank Riley Vetterkind, Molly Beck, and Bob Hague. Capitol Roundtable for the $81.7 billion budget. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This program is a production of WisconsinEye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. WisconsinEye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civic broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol. WisconsinEye would not exist without generous donors like you. Please visit wisci.org to make a donation today.